Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast, listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. Elijah Magnier returns to the show today. A new generation of Iraqis has new ideas and is not willing to accept an old corrupt system dominated by ruling parties and sectarianism. Iraqis want foreign meddling to stop, and they want reform and change. They want the country's resources to be used to improve the quality of life. Sayyed Moqtada al-Sadr has enormous influence over the protesters in the street and the ministers in the government. But what does Moqtada al-Sadr want to achieve? Prime Minister Mahdi inherited all of the corruption and deficits from previous governments, the complications of alliances with the US and Iran and neighboring countries, but his errors in handling the protests and his police forces and their violent crackdown led to his downfall. The search for a new leader of parliament and the important ministries is on, but there probably won't be a new election until 2021. Will this new generation of Iraqis succeed in acting as a check on the corrupt actors going forward? Elijah Magnier is a veteran war correspondent and a political analyst with over 35 years in experience covering the Middle East and North Africa. We recorded this on December 4th, 2019. Elijah Magnier returns to the show, speaking to us from Europe. Hello, Elijah. Thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Hello, Joanne. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks. I rely on you, and you're very generous with your time, and I really appreciate that. So today we're going to talk about, and I should mention that this is kind of a continuation of a long discussion that Elijah and I have had, and you may want to refer back to at least two of our previous episodes. Back in September of 2018, Elijah and I talked about Iraqi politics because at that point in time, they were trying to choose a new prime minister. And then a year later, we started to talk about this round of Iraqi protests in Iraq. And that was just this past October. Those are episodes 68 and 127, and they'll be linked in the show notes. And we're also going to talk about two articles that Elijah's just returned from the region. And he wrote two articles just in the past 2 days. I'll link those also. One of them is titled, Why Abdul-Mahdi Has to Go, Many Mistakes by the US, Iran, and the Marjaya. I'm probably mispronouncing that. And the other one is called, Who Holds the Initiative, and Who Has the Power to Mobilize the Street in Iraq? So the message comes through loud and clear in your first article from December 2nd, that, and I was fascinated by this, that this is not about other countries. This is about a new generation of Iraqis who have their own agenda. And like many other places in the world, as Elijah says, I'll quote him here, he says, demonstrators are not demanding a change in the democratic system, but an end of government mismanagement, the arrest of corrupt politicians, a new electoral system that allows people to choose leaders directly rather than from the major political parties, new job opportunities, nevertheless with serious constitutional reforms. And that sounds familiar to a lot of us, no matter what country you're from. Listening to this podcast, we have people, still mostly Americans, but there are people from all over the world who listen to this. It's a very international audience. And this is a fascinating thing, Elijah, but it also doesn't really surprise me. You know, I've got children who are of this new generation, right? They're in their 20s, they're adults now, and they've spent their whole life interacting with people elsewhere in the world, mostly through gaming. That's how it started. That's how they started to talk to other people. I mean, my one son, he and his group had this rival going on with these kids in South Korea. And, every night they would raid each other's, of course, they're opposite parts of the world, so they would raid each other's fortresses or whatever. And another son sort of really gets along well with some kids in Japan and in Sweden who happen to be two countries that, like, I'm just trying to say that they're from the internet generation. That's for one thing. And they have different ideas that have nothing to do with gaming or the internet either. And that's what we're seeing here too. I mean, this is a nationalist, to some extent, populist movement. Is that an accurate way to look at it?
In a way, yes. If we look at the demonstrators in Baghdad mainly, they come from all walks of life. And what is striking about them is since 2003, when I've landed in Iraq, I asked about the differences between Shia and Sunni, and everybody looked at me in a very strange way, and they said, there are no differences here between Shia and Sunni. And then later on, when al-Qaeda, that became later ISIS leader, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, started to kill Shia and to provoke them into a war with Sunni, and to an extent he has managed. Then the differences in the split was a little bit more obvious, but not to the extent of a sectarian war. And today we see the Iraq of before 2003 back, where we see the Yazidi, the Kurds, the Sunni, the Shia, the communists, everybody are all in the square. They all at the Turkish restaurant in Baghdad, and they are all against the corruption. They want job opportunities. They want a different ruling system. They don't want the big parties to rule them. They want to decide who is going to be the leader of the country. Of course, these are main and big slogans, not very easy to implement, particularly right. When they say, we want to rule. It is not a popular ruling. At the end of the day, they have to elect representatives of the people who are in the parliament. And so they are calling for reforms of the constitution to be able to make the necessary amendments so they can select the members of the parliament that really represent the population.
Right. So, and you can go back to our previous discussions where Elijah went into some real detail about how the Iraqi elections work and how these big parties work. Essentially, there's still sort of ruling. It comes down to a relatively small number of people who have the real power. Is that still true?
Oh yeah, it's a dilemma that today, after the resignation of the Prime Minister Abdul-Mahdi, the president is facing, because according to the constitution, the biggest party is the one with the right to nominate the candidate of the prime ministership. Now, who is the bigger party? The biggest party is the one who won the majority of seats in the parliament, or is the one who managed to form the biggest coalition in the parliament. So if we take the first one, we mean Muqtada al-Sadr was 53 members of the parliament. If we take the latter, it means the coalition of many groups, they have the right to choose. And if we go back to the election of Iyad Allawi and how Nur al-Maliki came to power, Iyad Allawi got 91 seats in the parliament and Nur al-Maliki got 89. And then at the end of the day, Nur al-Maliki managed to gather a larger coalition of 130 and told Iyad Allawi it's the biggest coalition and not the biggest single party. And this difference until today has not been resolved. And today, when Muqtada al-Sadr came forward and said, I don't want to be responsible for nominating the prime minister. This is his letter yesterday to the parliament, to the president, because it's up to the president to nominate a prime minister within 15 days. And he said, I give up on this right, but wickedly he passed it. He said, I am passing it on to the people. Now, who's going to be among the population who's going to come up and say, I want this prime minister to be appointed? He's
Yeah.
talking to 40 million people in the street and in their homes, and they have to decide. Now, how on earth, within 15 days, these will decide who is their candidate? So basically, what he's saying, we are back to square one. And then the Wales party, this is how they call them in Iraq, Hitan. So these Wales, the biggest parties, the biggest political parties, will end up selecting the prime minister. And we are exactly back to square one.
And you mentioned that Sistani has said to you, where do we get a qualified ruler? So, yeah, back to square one, back to the extremely difficult process that they had choosing a leader to begin with this time around. And, Muqtada al-Sadr, as I've said to you before, I don't understand this man. Now, is he saying that they're going to be able to cobble together a popular vote in this period of time, or does he think that some voice is going to rise up from the streets, that they're somehow going to be able to get together and make a decision and bring forth a leader? Like, do you have any idea what he's actually saying, or is he just sort of copping out?
Well, you asked the most difficult question on earth, because it is Muqtada Sadr doesn't understand what Muqtada Sadr wants. So I'll try to explain in the best of my ability. When Abdul-Mahdi was the best candidate for the Marja'iyya, because he was clean, he was professional, he was intellectual, with goodwill, doesn't belong to any big party, big organization, political organization, with all the goodwill to implement serious reforms. And he was faithful to the Marja'iyya, because the Marja'iyya has been saying exactly the same thing the street is claiming today. And the Marja'iyya has been saying this since 2003, 2004, and nobody is listening. So I remember when the Grand Ayatollah Sistani a year ago sent his son, Sayyid Muhammad Reza Sistani, and asked him to go and talk to Muqtada and ask Muqtada to give a chance to Adel Abdul-Mahdi, so the country can see if this man is serious and what he is capable of doing. And Muqtada promised to abide by this recommendation and to wait for the first year. And what he did, immediately after the end of the meeting, he came up with a communique saying, I am giving Adel Abdul-Mahdi 1 year as a test to see his performance and see what he's going to be able to do. And 2 months afterward, he started with manifestation in the street. 3 months afterward, 4, 5, 6, and every single month he would send people, his own people, to manifest toward the green zone. They went into the green zone. They were prevented another time from going into the green zone. The demonstrators clashed with the security forces, and Muqtada just doesn't give up. He has the largest number of ministers, the largest number of general directors in every single ministry. He had the largest number of ambassador. The ambassador in the UK has been nominated by him, one of the most important countries for Iraq. So, and he is at the same time the ruler and the opposition.
Oh.
And we don't know what he wants, because he himself doesn't know what he wants. He just wants to remind the Iraqis that he is present, that he has power, that he controls the streets. And apart from that, Adel Abdul-Mahdi ruled from November to November, 1 year. And during this year, Adel Abdul-Mahdi has inherited all the corruption of previous governments, and he started to reform in a country that just came out from a bloody war against ISIS that drained the country's resources, and the country's deficit is around 85 to 90 billion dollars. But the country is rich, and the country has asked the neighbor Gulf countries for support, and they said they will supply Iraq and they will lend Iraq around 40 to 45 billion dollars, and they didn't. So this is the situation Adel Abdul Mahdi is faced with, and on top of that, he's faced with someone that is called Muqtada al-Sadr, and he's faced with the American sanctions on Iran, and he needs to navigate between a good relationship with the US, of which he wants to maintain, and a no exit and a mandatory with a relationship with Iran, because it's a neighboring country. There are Shia pilgrims that travel by millions every year. Iran is supplying Iraq with gas and electricity, particularly for the southern provinces that are in need of electricity. There are goods that are extremely cheap, particularly with the US sanction on Iran, that are flooding the Iraqi market, and the Iraqis are very happy to buy very cheap products. They became cheaper than the Turkish and the Chinese products because of the devaluation of the Iranian currency. So the country is trying to stand on its own feet, but unfortunately, the domestic problem is bigger, and Abdul Mahdi is not in a position to handle all this at the same time. Particularly, he showed lack of experience in dealing with security issues.
So, is it accurate to say that there are two main things going on here, two huge problems, or maybe you could say three? One is that you have these large foreign powers that are basically tearing this country apart, because they all want to control Iraq, just to really boil it down. Then you have the Iraqi populace who has had enough of this, and they're saying, no, we don't want any of you to control our country. We want to control our country. I know this is really oversimplified, Elijah. And then lastly, that populace who does not want these outside powers to control them cannot come up with a leader who is strong enough. And I'm not sure that this is even possible from any human being. But they're out on the street. Moqtada al-Sadr has the most influence with them, but he himself is not a leader, or has chosen not to. I don't know whether he doesn't have it in him, or he doesn't want it enough, but he also doesn't seem to trust anyone else with that position. Is that somewhat accurate?
Well, Muqtada Sadr is a leader. He's one of the leaders, and he's one of the main leaders of the country. And he has resources because he's rich. He managed to make money out of various ministries, and he ruled throughout the last decade. And he has a large number of people who support him, particularly among the poor population in southern Iraq and in al-Sadr city, much less than before, much less than a year ago or 2 years ago. His reputation is decreasing rather than being stable or increasing. Muqtada Sadr doesn't want to rule himself because he knows he will go against the ruler at a certain point. But he wants to participate to the selection of the new ruler. And he wants to have his own ministers. He wants to be able to pick up which ministry is better for him. So, but at the moment, the choice that the discussion that is going on in Baghdad today and yesterday and since Monday is who is going to be the new ruler of Iraq. And the identity of the person has a specific specification. He must not be part of any of the big organizational groups. He must be an intellectual. He must be an independent, must be accepted by the population, accepted by all groups, accepted by the marja'iyah, and he must be really with a neutral identity. But then he will have to form a government, and when he's going to form a government, then who is going to take the interior and the defense ministries?
Right.
Who's going to take the finance and the foreign? So these four ministries are the most important ones: the foreign ministry, interior, finance, and defense. And these will be selected among the political parties or not. So it is not the problem who is going to be the prime minister only, it's the problem who are the member of the government. And the second point is this government will have one task, is to start reforming the constitution, start asking for laws against corruption and present these to the parliament. And it is the parliament that needs to agree upon all these points. And then to take the country to a new election in a year's time. What we're talking about is nothing is going to happen in 2020. So everything will be prepared in 2020 until in 2021 we have an early parliamentary election. And in the early parliamentary election, I can guarantee you that Muqtada is not, and I repeat, is not going to have 53 MPs, but he will be extremely lucky to have half of these, and mark my word on that.
Well, again, this may be my ignorance, but that sounds like what the process that they just went through with Mahdi a year ago.
Yes, that's true. Absolutely correct.
So, well, okay. And let's get to the big elephant in the room here too, just to remind people of just how much these people, well, first of all, do you know off the top of your head what percent of the population is, say, under 30 or whatever age is the cutoff?
No, I think it's really the majority are under 30 in Iraq.
Right. So they've all lived their entire lives in a war-torn country, and that's really an understatement. And just terrible turmoil, death and destruction, and they've made the best of it, but their entire lives have been spent with their country at war.
Yes, that is true. But the people who are in the street today are people who are much younger. They are 17, 18-year-old. And the majority of the population today that are is in the street, the youngsters, have no idea who are the political parties. I'll give an example. In Najaf, for example, they went to burn the shrine of Sayyed Muhammad Baqir Hakim because they believed he is the father of Sayyid Ammar Hakim, who is one of the biggest political parties ruling the country. When he is his uncle, he's not is not his father, and the relationship between him and his uncle from the political belonging is completely different.
Huh. Are they rejecting the sectarianism altogether? I think you already said something like that when we first started talking.
Well, today there is no talk about Sunni Shia and Kurds and Yazidi and Assyrian and Chaldean. There is no talk about all the different religions. This is how was Iraq. Today they're talking about reforms. They're talking about changes. And we're talking about more or less really a good 50% of the population that is under 30, and we're talking about more or less 20 million. People who are in the street are not 20 millions, they're not 10 millions, they're not 2 millions. but they are in different part of the country. So those who are sitting at home are the majority, but it doesn't mean those who are in the street have no right in their claim. Absolutely, they are really spot on in asking for the stolen money to be recovered, for a change in the constitution to make things clearer, particularly regarding many main issues about who is the biggest political party, what's going to happen with the federation with Kurdistan, because Kurdistan is more or less is acting as it is a kind of independent state where a vice U.S. president arrives to a military base in Iraq and doesn't visit the president and the prime minister, but he goes to Erbil to visit the Kurdistan leader. So we have this kind of things and these differences in Iraq between the Kurds and between Erbil and Baghdad. All these there are unresolved issues, and the other main thing is who's going to rule the country. Who are the parties who are going to rule the country? At the end of the day, these big groups and big organizations, big parties, are dividing the cake among themselves. Each one is taking the number of ministers because it has been agreed that each ministry corresponds to a certain number of MPs. So if one group has, let's say, 50 MPs, he can choose, let's say, the foreign ministry, and the foreign ministry will be equivalent to 40. So he can get the foreign ministry and a minor other ministries. Or he can get big ministries, but not the main four ones. So this kind of distribution, the street doesn't know that. The street is not talking about it. The street is general, is saying anti-corruption, job opportunities, reform of the constitution, early elections.
So they have, through their divisions of, these ministries, who gets control of the ministries, they've already sort of federalized the country informally. Now, the people on the street, do they seem to have any opinion? I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about, well, maybe Iraq should be divided up between, a Sunni state, a Shia state, and a Kurdish state. Do the people on the street, do they have solidarity regardless of what sect they're from? I know you've said that there's just no talk of that. But is there any sense of, well, maybe we should divide this country up? Maybe it should be a federalized state?
No, absolutely not. Nobody in Iraq is talking about the partition, at the exception of the Kurds and the Americans, is still in their heads. They're not exposing it. But the partition of Iraq is not off the table yet. Those who are observing the chaos in Iraq, and they call it a general chaos, which is not a general chaos at all. It's a chaotic local a local case, and we have many cases at the exception of Baghdad. So we see an uprising in Nasiriyah, and people will argue that 15 people were killed. What are you talking about? Yes, but the second day, everything is gone, finished. Nothing is happening anymore. One day, and it's over. In Najaf, it's exactly the same. One day is over. Last night, it picked up in Karbala, and today is over. It's finished. But in Baghdad, it continues opposite the Green Zone at the Turkish restaurant. This is the area on the bridge that leads to the area where there are all the government institutions and the embassies. So we're talking about the pressure in the street with the valid reforms, but we're not talking about the general chaos. And this dismantled the plan or the thinking or the idea of a general chaos and the partition of Iraq. There is no partition of Iraq. Everybody is going to work against dividing Iraq. Even the only people who would like to see that, as I said, are the Americans and the Kurds.
So they put Mahdi in place, and he seemed willing to do the kinds of reforms that are necessary, because while the Iraqis seem to be really good at calming things down. I've talked to you at times when you were in Baghdad, and you said that it was calm. People were, um, making the best of things. Sort of, it's amazing to me, given their circumstances, that they're even able to do that, but they do. But meanwhile, there are parts of the country where they still don't have reliable electricity or water. Um, as you said, the country's just being looted by the major parties in power who get in there and then they serve their own interests. And again, this is something that is to a different extent is happening elsewhere in the world, which have large ruling parties that fail the populace. They really don't represent the people. They represent themselves or the 1% or the 10% or whatever the ruling class is. Um, so if they bring in, and maybe you could just try to predict here a little bit. So if they find another person like Mahdi, not politically, but just his nature, who really do want to solve problems, are these political parties going to change? Um, are they going to do anything to start representing the people?
Well, I tell you, you touched upon a very sensitive area and a right one. Like in Lebanon, in Iraq, with the difference of Iraq is much wealthy and it's wealthier than Lebanon and has more resources. There is no consistent electricity, and there is a serious lack of electricity in a country where tens of billions of dollars have been spent on electricity without uh, getting it to the population. In Iraq, I remember in 2008, Nouri Maliki was planning to bring electricity to everybody, and he said the budget is $18 billion. And so far, $45 billion have been spent, and still the electricity has improved, obviously, but it is not up to the normal level where there is a 24 hours electricity a day. So, yes, people in the government are the ex-opposition of Saddam Hussein. When they arrived to power, I was sitting with Abdul-Mahdi a few years ago, before when he was Minister of Finance and then he was Vice President, and he says, we don't know how to rule. We have to reopen our offices in Damascus when Saddam Hussein was around because we know how to be in the opposition, but not to run the country and provide
Mm.
the country with everything the country needs. And he's damn right, because these people are new. What they saw is they saw Paul Bremer leading the country, their country, and stealing of it. The corruption was at the highest level. We saw then Ayad Allawi moving in, and all the opposition who were extremely poor people with no money becoming billionaires because they saw so much wealth and no laws and nothing to stop them. Well, today in Iraq and in Lebanon, politicians will start thinking before they steal the money. And they have to think very carefully and be extremely clever and have so many accomplices to steal the money of the state, because there are watchers now and there are people in the street who are asking, telling them, you're going to be judged and we're going to ask around the world, where do you have money to recall it back, and you are going to be judged. So this is the new element that has been introduced, and this hasn't been uh, present before. So if we talk about the positive aspect of the U.S. occupation of Iraq, I finally found one, which is the possibility for the youngsters and the population to go in the street without being killed by thousands, as Saddam Hussein did. Of course, people would argue that 432 were killed in the last protest in Iraq. Yes, it's true, but at the time of Saddam Hussein, nobody died, and there were tens of thousands in jail, not only people who are on the street, but also their family, relatives, tribe, etc. Now, the exactly the killing of 432 people in the street. Among these, there are tens of security forces, of course. That was the reason why Adel Abdel Mahdi had to go, because he did not manage well the safety of the protesters. He was incapable of holding on to the security forces and give his firm command. On the contrary, he made a huge mistake by asking the commanders to go and control the street. And when there were bodies in the street, then he court-martialed the commanders. And today the commanders are saying, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do anything because I will end up in jail in a death sentence on my neck. No. So because he has lost this kind of control, he had to go.
Right. And that really was the result, as you're saying, of the people on the streets. That's how they exercised their power. And they took down a prime minister who tried to bring things under control. And then when his military people did what he asked, he didn't back them up. And well, that's kind of a positive note, Elijah. It's really a shame that it has to come about in this way. But if the people on the street can force the major parties and the people in power to reform themselves, that sounds like the only short-term hope here until they can actually, redoing constitutions and things like that is usually not a short-term process. But if the people of Iraq can do what they've just demonstrated that they can do, maybe that's the bright side, as you mentioned. Maybe that's the upside. That's the positive thing we can take away from this.
Yes, that's true.
All right. Well, I've kept you more than a half hour, so I should let you go. I'd love to ask you more about Iran and Lebanon, but I know that would be a long conversation. But I appreciate your time. And I just want to mention that Elijah is a war correspondent for more than 30 years, and he writes for Al-Rai, but he also has in my opinion, immensely important effort going on as an independent journalist via his website and via social media. And I just want to ask people this is a very giving time of year, and I would just like to reach out and ask people to support this work. And you can do that by going to his website, and I will put links to all of that in the show notes. So please consider doing that if you have the means to do that. And Elijah, again, thank you so much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge and your decades of experience. I really, really appreciate it. And please take whatever time you like to say whatever else you'd like before we wrap up.
Well, thank you so much for the shout out. And thank you for this opportunity to come back always and to try to inform people what's happening. I live traveling to the Middle East to know what's happening and report from the Middle East, to talk to people in power, but above all, people in the street. And I live with them. I live in their homes. I have many friends. I don't go to hotels because I can't afford it. But that's also an advantage because even if I can, and even if I have the possibility to stay in a hotel, I don't. I live with people who are without electricity. I live with people when they don't have water, and I have to wash myself outside. And I am in the heat when it is 55 and 60 degrees in Iraq, and I don't have air condition. And that is an advantage. It's not a complaint, because it helps me to feel a bit what the Iraqis are feeling when I cover Iraq. And when I go to Syria, it's exactly the same. And I try to report to the audience from the ground, and I rely on their generosity, because today anyone with a mobile phone, with a smartphone, is pretending to be a journalist or an activist. So we don't have a lot of work these days. So thank you for all your support.
Thank you, Elijah. And if I don't see you before the holidays, I'm not sure what holidays you celebrate, but whatever ones they are, I wish you and your family the best and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Well, thank you. I celebrate all holidays, but working every day.
Okay. Well, do take some time off and have some fun.
Okay, thank you, Joanne.
All right.
All the best.
Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Elijah Magnier. Follow Elijah on Twitter at EJMAlRai, EJMAlRai. Read and support his work. You can find the links of how to donate to his work at ejmagnier.com. Around the Empire podcast is independent media. Your support is really important. Pitch in if you can at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or at paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. The audio podcast, there's a lot of ways to find it and to listen to it. Find it on any mobile podcast app or on the website aroundtheempire.com, on Patreon, or on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. If you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.